Hey everybody, this is your daily dose of all things royal. Welcome back, my gorgeous good-looking friends. Today we're picking right back up into part 2 of the misinformation, disinformation superstars, Meghan and Harry. If you haven't seen part 1, I highly suggest you watch that video first so you can get a better understanding to some of the references that are being made in this video. As a quick summary, part 1 covered a woman by the name of Renee Diresta and her role within the censorship industrial complex, and the interview Q&A she had with Vivian Schiller, who was the executive director of Aspen Digital, the same organization that Harry was the commissioner and worked on a report influencing policymakers and regulation that is being seen as undermining our Constitution. To finish up this video, I want you to hear what Vivian Schiller says about government officials and the top-down approach no longer effective. There's an absolute understanding as to why they feel it's now time to infiltrate the communities. Enter Meghan and Harry preying on the youth.
It's about reaching people in their communities as opposed to this top-down authoritative voice like the news media or a government official who we see in survey after survey are losing trust in the face of the American people, so many of the American people, and that but local authorities, somebody that feels like a peer or a neighbor is going to be a more trusted source.
And understand that this is all coming from a place of not being able to control the outcome of what happened in 2016. Many thought that it was going to go another way, but it obviously didn't and messed up the overall agenda. So to get that back on track, there is such a hard push of clamping down and controlling now what is being pushed out in front of people in order to maintain the narrative that these people in power want.
These briefings that, like we're doing with you right now, are intended to inform the members of our Commission on Information Disorder, as well as the general public, of course.
As you notice, this was done to help Prince Harry and the others be able to craft this report that has been pushed around, not only here in the United States, but also reaching Canada, the UK, Australia, to be used as part of the framework that governments are crafting in order to pass legislation around how you behave online. When people say that Harry and Meghan are not influential, think about how many people reference this report that Harry had direct involvement with in trying to lobby or change policy and regulation around freedom of speech.
Is there anything that you think the commissioners should know as they prioritize what issues and solutions they focus on across the board, whether it's for government, the private sector, or civil society?
So here, Renee lays it out on how to get this control back on what needs to be done.
I think that what we need to see is structural change. And what I mean by that is, we are constantly captured by the specifics of the narrative, right? By the specifics of the content. And there is something to be said for, rethinking how to handle communicating across all of these various issues. But ultimately, the reason all of these things persistently, the reason they persist, the reason they keep happening, the reason we do talk about the sense that this is happening everywhere on all topics simultaneously, globally, is because this is what the ecosystem facilitates. And so the question should be, in my opinion, how do we think about the ecosystem?
In the propaganda that Harry and Meghan have been pitching over the last 4 years since they left the royal family has been about redefining the digital media landscape.
And there are many different facets to that, but there are questions related to how do we preserve freedom of expression while at the same time thinking about what is served up to people, right? How do we think about amplification of particular types of content or particular types of speech? How do we think about the ethics of recommending content?
How do we think about the ethics of recommending content?
I think curation.
In other words, how do we prioritize putting the information that we want you to see, not as so much as what your interests are, and that would be relevant and being fair across the board in an unbiased manner, but how do we curate content that is to be pushed in front of you to get you to think a certain way?
Is one of the most significant challenges facing us, and actually an area where there is potential leverage for thinking in policy, education, and design terms
And this is it, guys. The three core pillars that is being focused on: policy, education, and design. I'm going to go into a second explaining how these three core pillars affect the ecosystem.
About what it means to curate information for people, which curation is not about censoring speech or limiting speech. It's about the recognition that all of our feeds are ranked, all of the information that we see is put through some form of filter.
All of our feeds are ranked. All of the information that we see is put through some form of filter.
And what are those filterings and rankings, and how can we perhaps evaluate them with an eye more towards creating a healthy information environment, or an information environment where reputable information is surfaced?
Let's all not forget that Renee and Alex, who are part of this Commission on Information Disorder, are currently being sued.
As opposed to whatever the, kind of consensus of the most likes. If it got the most likes on Twitter, that's the thing that you should see.
So in other words, if the mass majority likes something, but it's not aligned with the favorable speech that this political agenda is pushing, then it should be disqualified and disregarded. Do you see how warped and twisted this whole ideology is? She essentially is saying, how do we control the content and control what it is that people see in their feeds, regardless of if it is liked by a majority? How do we ensure that information that we want people to believe and not be challenged? Essentially, this is what she is saying.
I think that we have to do a little bit more strategic thinking around what those processes of curation really look like.
Strategic thinking. And that translates to, how are we going to change the behavior of getting people in line and singing the same song? Essentially, it's all about control and not threatening those in power who are pushing a lot of this stuff onto us, taking away more and more freedoms. And if you disagree because you feel differently about that, then essentially you are not being a team player and you're not all about doing the good for the better of mankind. Look, I don't want to be a global citizen that Meghan and Harry are selling. Let's call it what it is. So global citizenship is really communism. In part one, you heard the various tactics that Renee Diresta talked about regarding campaigns and how these campaigns are executed. Obviously, Harry and Meghan use these very same tactics to push out their propaganda. These two are very much on board and aligned with this agenda. So when we look at how these three pillars are marketed to the public, we see that within policy, the whole point Western governments are marketing to the public of doing it for the people and protecting the kids, keeping them safe. As far as education, you have these institutions where they're implementing the approved speech and learned behaviors in efforts to reduce harms within the so-called community. As far as the design goes, we see creating filtering tools and controlling the data flows of the online platforms will result in end users getting to sources of truth and reputable information, as well as access to proper and safe communities. This all sounds lovely and nice in theory, but this is not what the reality is of what is trying to be achieved. The people behind it and pushing this the harder are the ones that want to restrict people's freedoms and ability to challenge whatever agenda is being pushed. You see people who are preying upon the youth to get them into accepting certain behaviors and not being able to think for themselves, as well as really fundamentally getting around violating people's privacy rights and getting access to people's data in order to be used, whether it be for profit, whether it be to exploit and or intimidate to jeopardize someone's livelihood and or ability to thrive, taking away America's foundation of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When you take away people's right to express ideas freely and inject fear for doing it, then you're no longer free. Let this policewoman's face represent the chilling effects of how these European hate speech laws are being used as an excuse to abuse power and authority. Gotta be honest, because these hate laws in the UK are so loosey-goosey, it's like anything that you say that might offend will haul you off to jail. If I were the mother, I would file a counterclaim and have this policewoman arrested. You know, if we're gonna play this game of being subjective on meaning, well, this look to me looks like she is expressing hatred and should be hauled off to jail equally. Let's not forget they arrested that woman who was praying silently in her head, and that was still considered speech. So this look that this woman is giving, should qualify as it being hateful. And perhaps maybe they should test the law and see where it goes. Just my opinion. And the reason why I'm bringing these two examples up is because this fool is in this country right now trying to undermine our Constitution. This one protection that we have is something that these European countries do not. Even though these Western countries say that they have free speech, they do not have this special protection that Americans have. And the fact that this man is trying to take that away so we can get to a place where we're repressive, like what's happening in the UK, is a serious matter. So now I want to talk to you about the UK's involvement with this censorship industrial complex and the heavy hand and role that they play within it. This article comes from Declassified UK, which is an independent media outlet that investigates and tells the truth about the UK's global footprint and influence that it has around the world. So this article, and I'll link it below, states that the UK government has provided over £25 million to organizations targeting so-called disinformation, some of which are directed by former members of the British and US foreign policy establishment and are focused overwhelmingly on official enemies. Yes, folks, we're back to the censorship industrial complex map. And just to share with you, the organizations that the UK has been giving money to are Atlantic Council, with at least £6.7 million being given since January 2018. It's actually NATO's unofficial think tank. Then we have GDI, which stands for Global Disinformation Index, in which £2.7 million had been given since January 2018. And for those that are not aware, this Global Disinformation Index has a blacklist in which the New York Post, Daily Wire, pretty much any conservative, right-leaning, Republican news outlet is placed on, which, let's not forget that it was the New York Post that was suppressed in its news about the Hunter Biden laptop. This is what is getting these folks in some hot water. Other organizations being funded, we have Bellingcat, and obviously we know the Center for Countering Digital Hate, or the CCDH. So the UK very much has a presence and investment in seeing our speech suppressed. And also, they had an influence in our election. If they are part of this censorship industrial complex and suppressing media, especially right-leaning media, a lot of that had to do with during the time of the election to ensure number 45 would never get elected again. It is starting to bother me the more that I learn about the UK's involvement in this censorship industrial complex. And now, as I look at everything, I have to come to the conclusion that King Charles must be okay with what his son is doing over here. The more and more I think of it, I think Americans should be outraged that the king has not come out and denounced his son for interfering with American politics. I think it's telling that even the bare minimum of separating the monarchy from Harry and his political crusade to tear down free speech, the fact that Harry hasn't been removed from the website and still listed as serving the monarchy, leads me to believe that King Charles is in support of this, and that should make so many people upset to think about. And I don't want to hear it from everybody by saying that the monarchy is playing the long game. They're playing the long game to protect themselves. They're not playing the long game to benefit humanity. Because right now, what's going on, we have laws being passed right now that are clamping down on people's freedoms as we speak. It's abundantly clear that governments are coming together to enact sweeping legislation that is going to take away your freedom of expression and speech online. As I've stated before, it's going to be under the guise of keeping the community safe and protecting people while holding large tech companies accountable. Several countries that we are aware of are establishing a vast censorship framework. This framework has been heavily influenced by this censorship industrial complex by the likes of organizations such as the Aspen Institute. I can't stress it enough, and you guys can think what you want, but it is being used and referenced in a lot of recommendations, not only here in the United States in our policy and regulations, but also across the pond. As you can see, I'm not making this stuff up. And although authorities claim that their goal is merely to protect us from disinformation, vague definitions and loopholes will create avenues for broad application. It leaves the door wide open for broad application, abuse, and overreach. We clearly saw that with this 16-year-old autistic girl this week. What we fully need to understand is that this is an international effort. Government officials and NGOs aim to gain total control over online speech by forcing these tech companies to comply with their desired rules. We're seeing this now with Canada and Facebook. UK lawmakers have threatened to imprison social media managers who don't censor enough content. And what we're seeing in Brazil, they've introduced some of the strictest penalties for platforms that fail to remove the so-called fake news. Did you guys know that under the European Union's Digital Services Act, large tech companies must share their data with vetted researchers like a Renee Diresta from nonprofits and academia, thereby ceding content moderation to NGOs and their state affiliates? There's a big concern in what we're seeing with some of these laws, like in Ireland, for example, citizens can now be imprisoned for possessing material that officials decide is hateful. The government may soon have the authority to monitor the internet activity of any American it deems to be a security risk. And now we're seeing this all come out about the Twitter files and how the government targeted conservatives. Imagine if you have an opinion, let's say, is not aligned with what the establishment is. Guess what? You could be penalized and, there's nothing you can do about it. I feel sorry for Canada. How can you tote free speech when a state agency can now filter and manipulate what Canadians can see online? Same thing with Australia. A single government official, one person, can compel social media companies to take down a post. And being that this is a tough nut to crack here in the United States, it's why we're seeing people like Prince Harry come over here to influence and be vocal supporting organizations who are exactly trying to do that with lobbying and pushing legislation, which surprisingly, a lot of these organizations that Meghan and Harry support are the organizations in Europe who are trying to drive this global framework. Take, for example, Prince Harry and Meghan working with Five Rights Foundation. How many people remember that Harry has been helping to launch an online safety toolkit with its focus on children? Harry and Meghan both have been aligned with the Five Rights Foundation, which is a London-based nonprofit, and they're described as a roadmap for policymakers and practitioners building a digital world that supports children and enables them to flourish online and beyond. As I've stated before, Archwell has attached itself quietly to a lawsuit that involves the California law that was passed for gathering and choosing the type of content that children should be able to see, in which NetChoice is suing because it's violating First Amendment rights. Harry and Meghan are in full support of California's new law that has passed around deciding what your children can see and adhere to whatever guidelines or whatever that they think is harmful to children. And Five Rights Foundation is also attached to this lawsuit as well in supporting the state of California in hopes that this law gets adopted across the entire country. I think this is dangerous, but hey, nobody's talking about it because it's on the down low. It's definitely what Harry and Meghan don't want you to see, and that's why we have all this distraction coming from them. In part 3, we're going to be talking about all the things that Meghan and Harry don't want you looking at, hence why we're seeing all this distraction. So while Megsy is coming out looking like she's on the verge of a mental breakdown, there is a purpose behind it. I'll go more into that in part 3, so stay tuned for that. But to close out this video, I want to share an article written by Michael Schellenberger that explains potentially what is really going on here and why there is such a push with our current administration and certain foreign agents from the UK, Harry. Newly released internal emails show that Facebook executives felt pressure to comply with White House demands in order to resolve a European Union ban on the social media company's ability to transfer the data of European users to its servers in the United States. In July 2021, after a White House official demanded that Facebook censor more information, Facebook's Vice President of Global Affairs and Communications, Nick Clegg, asked his colleagues to comply. The reason? Because of the bigger fish we have to fry with the administration, data flows, etc. By data flows, Clegg was referring to the EU's demand that Facebook stop transferring European user data, which Facebook advertisers value for targeting customers, to the United States. The dispute was no small matter. In May of this year, EU regulators fined Meta, Facebook's parent company, a record $1.3 billion for breaking the EU's privacy regulations. The regulators said that Meta had violated a 2020 ruling by the EU's highest court. 2 months later, on July 10, 2023, the Biden administration and European Union announced a deal, the EU-US Data Privacy Framework. The series of events suggests a quid pro quo. Facebook would bow to White House requests for censorship in exchange for its help with the European Union. This is a gross violation of the First Amendment, Columbia Law School professor Philip Hamburger told Public, not only because it involves what the Supreme Court considers coercion, but also because it's equally unconstitutional for the government to seek censorship through contract or conspiracy. And that's what happened here. The White House wasn't the only entity demanding that Facebook censor. NGOs and journalists from NBC and the New York Times were also pressuring Facebook to censor more. In response, Facebook executives weighed the radical blockholing measure, which blocks links to external websites without informing users. But the new emails point to a form of government leverage over the platform that has been ignored until now. The EU demand on Facebook to stop data flows from the EU to the US and the conditional willingness of the White House to push back against it. A potential end of EU to US data flows is an even more urgent threat to Facebook's business than White House threats to Section 230. About 10% of Facebook's total global advertising revenue, $1.2 billion, comes from selling ads in the EU. While neither Congress nor the Biden administration have shown much willingness to follow through on their threats to modify Section 230, the European Union has imposed fine after fine on Meta Facebook. Last November, EU regulators fined Meta $291 million for a leak of its data. And in January of this year, they fined Meta $429 million for making users accept personalized ads in order to use Facebook. So just so everybody understands this, your governments in the EU are selling your data out. Those privacy laws don't seem so private anymore because of this agreement with the US, which means your data can be transferred over jurisdictions for American intelligence agencies to gain access of European Union residents. I don't know how you guys feel about that. The members of the European Parliament had no direct role in the negotiations. And, they say that the framework does not provide any meaningful safeguards against indiscriminate surveillance conducted by U.S. intelligence agencies. The lack of protection leaves Europeans' personal data vulnerable to mass surveillance, undermining your privacy rights. As you can see, slowly but surely, at least in the EU, the governments are selling the people out. In the US, it's going to be tough because we have our First Amendment and our Fourth Amendment to break down, which is exactly what Prince Harry and traitor Meghan Markle are doing here in the United States. And they're attacking it from different angles that I will be showing you in part 3. So on that note, I hope that this video was informative. I hope it's valuable. If you didn't, that's okay too. I felt that this is important, at least to do my part in creating this awareness. But on that note, please let me know your thoughts. Also, I'd just like to take a moment and remember our dear friend Ashley. It's been a year since she passed away, and a lot of this fight that we do around exposing Meghan and Harry is a result of some of the things that she fought for. And we all know that Meghan and her goons did give her kind of trouble. And it's really for us to continue to keep fighting, at least, to make it that all her effort has not been in vain. So I would just like to say that, yes, still think about our precious Ashley, and I hope that she is resting in peace. Let's all not forget that she was the first to call out Meghan and Harry and expose them for the evil that they are. I think a nice gesture. I mean, many people talk about getting to this 100,000, and while although I will get there eventually, I think of all people that deserve to reach that 100,000 is Ashley. So I would like to ask if we could do the kind favor and get her numbers up and get her there. So at least her family can have, at least YouTube will send them the plaque, and I think it would be a nice way of saying that we are still thinking about her. And as Ashley would say at the end of all her videos is, thank you for spending time with me. I will see you soon. We'll talk fast. Stay safe. Be blessed. And know I love you.
Such a fraud.